a lot of job displacement can happen as a result. And so one way of dealing with it is we've got centralized wealth creation and centralized wealth ownership, and then governments have to redistribute this in the form of universal basic income. So that's one way of thinking about the whole problem. But then if we take a more like ownership, decentralized AI approach where you can say like, okay, I don't have to trust an organization. I can independently verify what happened here. My whole perspective is that essentially we've used a quote unquote backend technology and then just slapped some type of arbitrary front end on it, which is a wallet. And then we expect people like, okay, like this is your front end now, you need to adopt to it, versus the other way around.
Hey, Michael. And hi, everyone. Welcome to the Fractal Podcast. You know the drill. I'm Spencer, one of the core contributors for Fractal. And we love having awesome guests and folks in the industry to come on the podcast to essentially share about what's the latest and greatest. And today we have a very special episode with Michael of Zero G to talk about AI and all the kind of awesome intersections between what we are doing in the crypto and Bitcoin space and also AI. So yeah. Super awesome to have you, Michael. We'd love to have you give everyone an introduction of yourself.
Yeah, super excited to be here. So I love the name of the podcast. Fractals are always really beautiful structures in nature. But my personal background is I started on the kind of engineering side at Microsoft and SAP Labs, switched in more and more into the business side, basically went to technical product management and worked as a management consultant at Bain & Company, then went into TradFi as part of Bridgewater Associates. And then decided it was time to join and start my first entrepreneurial venture. Went back to graduate school at Stanford, started my first Web2 unicorn called Garten, and then eventually kind of sold the company. And in 2022, one of my classmates basically called me up and said, hey, I've invested in a company called Conflux 5 years ago. Ming and Fan are awesome founders. They want to start something more global scale. You're interested in meeting up with them? And 6 months of co-founder dating later basically said, wow, these are like the best engineers and computer scientists I've ever worked with. Like, we need to start something. I don't care what it is. We just need to start something. And it really started with the team. And this was essentially May of 2023. That's when we formed Zero G. And yeah, now essentially we're here. So, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about my background in crypto as well. Back in graduate school, that's when I first heard about Bitcoin. And like Mark Andreessen talked about it. I was a DFJ fellow at the time. So Tim Draper talked about it. I spent some time with him. My classmates were talking about it. And I was like, okay, I get the message. All right, let me get into Coinbase, check this thing out, buy some Bitcoin. And I was hooked after that. Did a bunch of the kind of ICO investing, 2016, 17, and then did even some ETH mining, Bitcoin mining for fun. And then knew at that point I wanted to be in the industry at some point in the future.
That's amazing. I think it's definitely one of those things where anyone can come from any part of the space, wherever you are. And then because of the collective experience and skill sets that we all kind of bring to the table, you then are able to create a lot of value, right? I think that's really what it is. So what's your motivation these days? Why do you feel after building in a space for a while, you want to continue building and you want to keep going? What's driving you?
For me, I like having a very central mission that gives me meaning in my life. I'm not the type of person that can just kind of relax on the beach for the rest of my life. I feel like I have a specific mission that I want to accomplish. And these days, I've been thinking about the dangers of AI and how we actually get to making AI a public good so that everybody can enjoy this technology and hopefully that it creates abundance in all of our lives. So that's not a technology that we fear, but a technology that creates a lot of happiness and abundance for everyone, and not just for a select few.
Yeah, that's very meaningful. I think a lot of criticisms of AI even, right? It's around how it creates a bit of centralization of power and also resources. And I think like the ability to kind of like spread that out over, to a larger audience, I think is very awesome, right? And I think that goes very well with the crypto ethos as well of decentralization, coordination, a lot of these other things as well. So I guess like when you and your co-founder started looking into the AI space and of course landed on the vision for focusing on decentralized AI, what is kind of the thinking over there? I'm sure there are other problems that you could have dived into as well. So why this specific area?
Yeah, when we started, basically, we wanted to find something that's at the intersection of, what are we passionate about? Where do we have deep domain expertise in? And then what's going to be a major unlock for the space? So it was kind of like this Venn diagram, and we wanted to be exactly at the middle. And initially, we did a lot of searching. We talked to a bunch of founders just to get familiar, like what are some of the key problems that need to be unlocked. And before we could even get into like how do we decentralize AI, we basically realized that blockchain speeds and data throughput needs to be solved as an issue. And it just so happens that Ming, as part of his like 11 years of Microsoft research, is a distributed storage and scalability expert as well. And so we were like, we can solve this problem. Like basically what we do is we segment data into a storage and into a data publishing lane, and thereby create parallelization, which means that effectively you can infinitely scale data throughput. And when we looked at Ethereum with about 80 kilobytes per second of data throughput versus hundreds of gigabytes in AI data centers, we're like, okay, if we need to decentralize this, we need a different infrastructure. So that's really how we approach the system, the problem first. And then we said, okay, now that we've solved this, what do we need to do next? Okay, then comes the kind of compute and the chain perspective. All right, and in compute, we break down in inference, fine-tuning, and training. Training being the hardest, just because there's a lot of research, open research questions. But in inference, we're like, okay, there's many flavors. There's ZKML, there's OPML, there's SPML, there's TEML. The most practical from a cost standpoint, if we want to attract Web2 builders into Web3, is TEML. How do we do that in a permissionless, decentralized, and fully verifiable way? And so then we built the whole service marketplace and compute infrastructure. So it's a very much a like first principles, step-by-step approach. So one problem at a time, so that we can create this very large AI ecosystem. So it's as easy building with 0G as it is on an open AI, essentially.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think you also mentioned Web2 builders, right? I think what's awesome about this way of thinking about things is that you are able to attract all kinds of developers to essentially contribute, and also build with the platform. What do you think are some differences that you've observed when you're talking to Web2 developers versus the Web3 developers and crypto developers?
Yeah, so if they're Web3 native developers, they think community first. If they're Web2 native developers, then they think more about, what's the business model? How is it sustainable? So generally different ways of thinking. If they're pure Web2 developers that are just in the open source community, they tend to be closer to the Web3 developers from what we've seen. So much more like public good focused and so on. So they definitely want to get that early adopter in first.
I see. That makes sense. So it's almost like it helps you with segmenting and targeting too, right? So if you look at these Web2 developers that are onboarding with you and they actually have quite a bit of open source contributions, then perhaps the way that they can understand this ethos that you have is a little bit easier too. One of the things that you mentioned is really around, the way that you are thinking about the different problem spaces. And I think you mentioned how training is actually quite challenging and so on. I'd love to kind of hear a little bit on essentially, I think one of the core questions that many people, including myself, have is how is, this decentralization helping to advance AI development as well? Or is that relevant in the first place?
Yeah, you can think of dealing with the problem of abundance in two ways. And I explain why I think it's a problem of abundance. So on one hand, you can have centralized authorities, basically, like an open AI, which we call closed AI, because ironically, open AI is closed AI because you can't verify. You don't know where the data came from, who labeled the data, like what censorship decisions were being made, how the model was being aligned, like does the model have an inherent bias with the data that was presented? Can't verify any of it. So you're trusting this authority. And if you play that out, I don't know, 10, 20 years, and you believe what McKinsey says, which is 70% of all human commerce can be automated and create trillions of dollars of value, then a handful of companies basically, quote unquote, own commerce from that perspective because they own the intelligence that goes behind it. And so with all of that wealth, a lot of job displacement can happen as a result. And so one way of dealing with it is we've got centralized wealth creation and centralized wealth ownership. And then governments have to redistribute this in the form of universal basic income. So that's one way of thinking about the whole problem. But then if we take a more like ownership, decentralized AI approach where you can say like, okay, I don't have to trust an organization. I can independently verify what happened here. I know where the data came from, who labeled the data, what censorship decisions were being made, what the weights and biases of a particular model are, how was it aligned, like how's it running in production? Am I actually being served the model that I expect? All of that I can then independently verify, and by my contribution, I can actually get resources in return. And so then you don't need UBI because just by participating in a system, providing data or even just getting tokens for proof of humanity, you can essentially enjoy that abundance in a different way. So it's fundamentally a very different way of thinking about the world, where it's creating abundance for everyone via contribution and ownership versus, hey, somebody else has the resources and you're just going to get some handouts.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating about this approach is that you're creating almost like an economic system, right, that ties in a lot of these various sort of actors, and then anyone can participate, right, in that sense. And I think the system and the design of that is also open for anyone to interpret and to also verify. I think that's really awesome. I think what I saw is that you guys broke out these various services as AI service, compute, serving, and so on. I think you mentioned some of these earlier. How should anyone looking at your service be sort of differentiating across these various things? How does it all kind of tie in? And what's kind of the first touch point that maybe a developer or a user would have with Zero-G in the first place?
Yeah, we want to make the developer experience as simple as working with an OpenAI, because there you just have a set of APIs, you add it to your application, and it's super simple. Now, if you're a new developer and you come into Web3, you're like, okay, well, I need to use decentralized inference. Where do I start? Do I use ZKML? Do I use OPML? I don't even know what the terms mean. I don't even know how optimistic machine learning works. What kind of game is that? So all of a sudden, you have all of this overhead in terms of learning and where to go. And before you know it, you have 10 different services you need to cobble together to even build an application. And so how do we simplify this? We basically say, okay, we have built the largest layer 1 network, and that's powered by a decentralized AI operating system. And just like you have an operating system on your phone, and you don't really care what's behind the background. You don't care how iOS or Android does garbage collection, for example. You don't care about how it does application management. You don't care about how the App Store works. You just use it. And so similarly, we want to make it as simple of an experience, but the difference is that we're not the ones that are building all of this technology. We're pulling in all of the AI community to make that possible. So even on the TEML inference stack, it's essentially our chain, it's our service marketplace where we use a lot of ZK technology, but we're partnering with, Aether and Hyperbolic and Akash and then Fala and so on. But the developer doesn't need to worry about that. All they need to do is just utilize, our SDK and build on top of us. So that's how we really look at that.
That's awesome. Yeah, and then what are some of the prerequisites that developers should have? What should they be familiar with? What programming language, if it matters? Or how do you think about that abstraction as well?
Yeah, what we want to get to eventually is that no matter what programming language you're familiar with, you can build in that language. I'd say we're maybe 2 years away from accomplishing all of that, because it's just so hard to build all of the kind of abstractions into it. But we use a lot of kind of TypeScript, Go, and then over time we want to support other libraries like Rust and Python, even Move kind of base languages on the VM side. But that's all kind of future facing. So ideally, they know one of the languages we support currently, and kind of build from there. But the SDK is very well documented, so it should be pretty straightforward to get up and running.
That's awesome. And when's the marketplace launching? And what can users expect? I noticed that there's a coming soon on the documentation page.
Yeah. So there's a service marketplace, which is basically, think of it like an app store where anybody can register, they can provide services, and then other users can basically subscribe and utilize the services and do some type of token-based payments with the token. So that essentially is in production. We're testing a lot of that. And then there's another marketplace that we're thinking about, which is more focused on the agentic side. So that's coming soon, sometime in February. So very excited about all of that. And then kind of once our mainnet launches, then you can, again, have a whole perspective of, well, how do I launch some agents that have token models associated with them as well? And that's not a trivial thing, because we had to define a whole new token standard in order for that to happen. How do you know today that an agent belongs to me? You have to use a centralized server, because otherwise, how do I know that this agent that's on this chain belongs to Michael? We basically developed an NFT standard where it's very clear that this agent belongs to Michael. So it's 7857, if I remember the number correct. There's a new token standard. And so that's going to be on the marketplace as well. So a lot of really deep thinking and research is going behind this.
That's really awesome. And I think you mentioned Agentic Finance. I do want to dive a little bit into that. Recently, there's definitely some people who talk about this as almost like a new category. Def AI or DeFi or whatever, right? So tell us a little bit, like what's happening in that space. Why is it that suddenly almost like we start talking about this, whether it's ELIZA, whether it's virtuals, whether it's AI XPT, why is it now that we finally are seeing some of these things happen?
Yeah, the space has seen the application of AI technology in the form of agents on Twitter or X essentially, where, for example, AI XPT has some of the highest mindshare numbers on Kaito, for example. And so people are starting to see like, oh, actually, this works. The intelligence is there. Can we use this now and put it into a different domain and actually completely change the user interface that we're used to in crypto? My whole perspective is that essentially we've used a quote unquote backend technology and then just slapped some type of arbitrary front end on it, which is a wallet. And then we expect people like, okay, like this is your front end now, you need to adopt to it, versus the other way around. And so for the first time, we have this opportunity to completely abstract away from it and just say like, hey, I have an agent, kind of like, I don't know, the Avengers personal assistant to Tony Stark. It's just like you tell it something and it does it for you. You don't need to worry about like, do I need to use this bridge? Do I need to use Wormhole? Do I need to, like swap this token on Uniswap beforehand? Like all of that is then done for you. And then even more abstractions could be like, hey, I want to generate 10% yields and I want to do it in the safest way possible. Do not take smart contracts, as little smart contract risk as possible. Agent can figure it out for you. So that's like the level of abstraction we can get to. And I think that's super exciting.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's one of those things where, honestly, a lot of things that culminated in ChatGPT being popular back in the day was also a lot of the work that the research community, the engineering community has done for a long time. But then with the interface of a chat window, people were then able to sort of interact with it and kind of like see it for themselves. And I feel like in some ways, it's almost like these conversational bots is a very like see it and believe it kind of situation compared to like, I need to understand it, right? So perhaps that AI XPT sort of like bot interface or whatsoever, I think was able to help people at least get some understanding. And then there was also this meme coin wave that happened too, right? That it kind of like, I think, intersected together. Let's hear what's your take on that. Like, what's your take on meme coins? And of course, over the past weekend, Trump, Melania, whatsoever. So it's been crazy. Yeah.
It's been crazy. So on one hand of the spectrum, people would say meme coins are just gambling, essentially. On another hand of the spectrum, people would say, well, no, actually, meme coins are communities. They're a sense of belonging. They're a sense of like standing for something. And I think Murad talked about that it's like there's an unbundling of religion, and then meme coins are like replacing religion, essentially creating these like movements where people feel like I belong to this now, and I'm like excited and I can make money at the same time. And so I think my perspective is over time, I've come to appreciate them more as this like community force. Because sometimes it is very hard to understand if a new technology comes out for the average user, like, is this a breakthrough or is this just like some ChatGPT wrapper, for example? Versus with on the meme coin side, it's much more fulfilling this need of, like entertainment, community, belonging, and so on. So I think meme coins from that perspective definitely serve a purpose. And we very clearly saw that, Trump being launched and having so much success behind it that people really rallied and they felt like, oh, wow, this is like a rallying cry for the industry. Like, I want to be a part of it. And yeah, so they serve their purpose from that perspective. But the thing that I worry about is that if there's too many meme coins, then very serious builders might get disillusioned. And they're like, I guess we'll just do a meme coin now. Screw this like hard technology development that actually pushes the space forward. Like, it seems like this is where the mind share is, so I need to launch a meme coin. And so I think that's a little bit dangerous from that perspective.
Yeah, I definitely see that. I think for the past weekend, just talking to some builders and also recently just following along what's been happening on crypto Twitter in the Ethereum community too, right? There's a lot of criticism about like how, hey, the Ethereum Foundation needs to be doing more and so on. And that's almost like in some ways, almost like a knee-jerk reaction, but it's been like building up for a long time, right? Of like the reflection of the market value and the price perception of Ethereum in some sense, right? So I think that is a little bit worrying to me because I do know that sometimes good things do take time to be built, especially, for example, anything that, we are, as serious builders are looking at. These are like very tough problems, right? That we are all kind of solving. And sometimes, it's very easy to kind of look the other way and say, hey, the grass is green on that side of the pasture. It seems that people just care about this, random memes that get popped up, right? So I do see a bit of the conflict. How do we kind of like, reconcile that, right? I think that's the question.
Yeah, totally. And then the kind of natural question is like, well, do I need to like work with like 8 computer science PhDs to make a ZKML reality, or can I like just launch a ZKML, meme token and like retire? Well, I definitely hope it's the former, and that the space will definitely also have room for both, where it's like, hey, you get the sense of belonging and this excitement, but at the same time, we're actually pushing the space forward so that we can get back to the ideals of like true ownership and redistributing social good to everyone, so that it's not just in the hands of a few.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think a lot of times, even like the token economics of some of these platforms are quite extractive in nature.
Yep.
Obviously, I'm not an expert in tokenomics of like AI service platforms and so on, but I've seen definitely some modifications recently on the virtual side and so on. So I think it does create some questions, like, hey, what is the perfect model, if there is any at all, right? For a very long time, the market in our industry has rallied around certain models for like exchanges, DEXs, and so on. So it's kind of interesting to see what would that be. And even like ChatGPT and some of these other platforms, they haven't really figured out their final business model yet, right? I think like Sam Altman did say one time that, hey, at the end state, you can probably just ask the AI to figure out the business model. I'm not sure that's the best answer, but maybe I buy it. I don't know. What's your take on that?
I hope he won't give the same answer if you ask him about like, how do you align these AI models with human interests? And it's like, oh, we'll just figure it out. We'll ask them. Which I think at that point it's a little too late, and we just put our hope into lots of software that hopefully, well, I wrote one X post and basically I was kind of joking about saying that one day we'll wake up and we realize we are the killer app for somebody else.
So I feel like that may not be too far from reality.
Yeah, so I think we need to start thinking about it now. So we're actually, we haven't announced it yet, but we're going to be doing a lot of different research initiatives with different universities to really think about like, what does AI alignment look like by utilizing blockchains, for example? Are there ways of aligning models real time? Are there ways of aligning models or agents, even continuously? Are there ways of aligning them before they even get pre-trained? There's a lot of interesting questions, like where does alignment even start? Does it start with the initial training data? Does it start with the labeling? Like, where does it start? So I think there's some really interesting kind of research questions to come up with this answer, because I think centralized AI researchers or closed AI researchers don't know the answer either. They're like, well, maybe we have two agents debate each other and then they come up with the best answer. But what's going to prevent the agents from colluding with each other? If we get to ASI or artificial superintelligence, those agents are like, hey, we can like fool these humans in believing that we're aligned, but all we're doing is just extracting value for ourselves. Like, so yeah, need to do a lot better on that aspect.
Yeah, that feels like some people's like, sort of criticism of meme coins too, right? It's like, oh, it feels like culture, but actually it might be value extractive in some ways. People can be fooled quite easily. I guess like one of the things that I think you mentioned earlier was also like how you came into crypto first by discovering Bitcoin, reading about it and hearing about it. I guess like, coming almost like full circle, right? Now that you're focused on AI and so on, where do you think, like Bitcoin has in the world of like DeFi or, AI and so on? Where do you think, Bitcoiners or Bitcoin builders should be focusing on? Given everything that's happening?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, from one end, Bitcoin as just kind of a store of value and providing, for example, security to a network makes a lot of sense. So any DeFi kind of application that needs kind of a layer of security and a layer of kind of commitment, I think there's some interesting kind of application spaces there. I also think there's some really interesting applications being built from a Bitcoin kind of PayFi perspective. So potentially some of these DeFi agents can then use different types of payment channels that are enabled through Bitcoin for that particular application purpose. So I think there's a lot of really interesting kind of financialization parts in combination with AI that can be looked at. I'm sure somebody's going to figure out some interesting way of saying like, hey, what if we align this model like long term by giving it some Bitcoin and then believing in like the future of humanity or something like that. I don't know what those are going to be yet, but I think there's some interesting aspects there too. And then maybe from a just pure kind of chain-based view, are there ways of improving on proof of work and doing something like proof of useful work? So if you're doing a particular AI computation, for example, may it be inference or fine-tuning, can that be used to then secure the blockchain as well, so that it's not as resource intensive? So I think there's some interesting research and building opportunities there too.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that insight. I think one of the things that you mentioned earlier was also around this new token standard that you guys are building that is non-fungible standard. It's almost like a NFT standard. Of course, on the Bitcoin side of things, we do have ordinals, we have inscriptions and so on. And I kind of wonder aloud as you were talking about that earlier, if that similarity or some of those kind of properties can actually be an inscription standard as well on Bitcoin. We'd love to dig into that as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. We should look into that actually. Yeah.
Awesome. Yesterday or today, actually, and of course, by the time we publish this, it'll be like a week or two ago, is the inauguration of President Trump, the 47th president of the US. And of course, many things have happened over the past couple of months since the elections. We'd like to hear kind of your take, just because I think you traverse between the US and Asia and many other parts of the world. What's your take on that? What's going to happen? What's going to change in your mind if you were to kind of crystal ball gaze it? And I'm sure we will always be wrong, just because, forward-looking stuff is always a little bit difficult to get right.
I mean, the very fact that the president launched his own meme coin, just speaks very highly in terms of what's going to happen from a crypto industry standpoint, having a crypto czar as well. And then obviously Elon Musk with kind of Doge type of memes and governmental efficiency and so on, I think spells a lot of bullish sentiment towards the crypto industry or Web3 industry as a whole. My only concern is that if the pendulum swings too far on one side, it generally ends up swinging back very strongly as well. So I just want to make sure that it's not too extreme as well. But definitely very excited about all the campaign promises of let's make Bitcoin a reserve currency, and then other nations already starting to follow suit and buying kind of more Bitcoins for their reserves as well. It shows kind of broad-based adoption and Bitcoin really becoming like gold at this point. And the key question is, will it become more than that over time as well? But in general, a very bullish sentiment. The key question for me, as I mentioned, is, are we going to overdo it? And then two, how's it going to impact the regulatory landscape as well? Because at this point, there's still uncertainty. Like launching a token in the US with like a C Corp, for example, has been an official no-no. But maybe that's going to change now with this kind of Trump meme coin launch. And so I'm very, very optimistic about that.
Yeah, it's almost bizarre how the regulators have been kind of going after some of these builders for a long time, right? And then with this event happening over the weekend, I guess the question is does it set a standard? Right? I know in some countries, case law is the fact that you're not going after some of these targets equate to almost acceptance, right, of that. And of course, the US legal system is different, and of course, we're not lawyers, so it's really interesting to see and unpack at some point what is that kind of repercussions, if any at all, or is it just kind of a non-issue, right? And also with the new, and also at the end of the day, the SEC and the regulators have regular staffers too, right? And of course, you do have these heads that actually change, but with the regular staffers, I wonder how big the impact will actually be as well. And I think one of the things that you mentioned about sort of preaching a little bit about balance, I do agree with that sentiment too, which is that sometimes when you swing too far left or right in the pendulum, it can kind of violently go back the other way, and that's not great, right? So I think that's kind of one of the things that we definitely want to avoid, in this next couple of years.
Yeah, and we'll have to see how this whole kind of meme coin launch is perceived as well, because people might say some parts of it are not aligned with the Constitution, because the Constitution says no foreign government interference, for example. Can other people investing in this meme coin from other governments be considered that, for example? Or is there going to be a backlash because there is no KYC or AML done as part of this? How do we think about all of these types of issues? And there's a bunch to figure out just from a regulatory perspective. And the faster we get clarity on it, the easier it's going to be for builders. For me personally, we had to set up, the whole foundations. We have 4 entities now, because we need to make sure that the token is generated correctly, then the token is also launched correctly and governed correctly by a different set of organizations. And when I say we, it's separate organizations, but I represent the LabCo and I'm an advisor to the foundation, but they're all different entities that had to be spun up and have to be managed by different people.
Yeah, I agree with that. Self-thinking, it's almost this little hoops and stuff that we have to kind of jump through in order to be more compliant and also self-compliant, right? I think we are just kind of figuring out the rules, and definitely clarity of rules will help, just builders just to have more efficiency, right? And of course, Zero G and your team has been very successful on the fundraising front, and also over the last 1 or 2 years. We'd love to kind of hear your advice or tips for builders who are looking for their first fundraise or to do their second round or whatsoever, as it gets harder, right? So we'd love to hear how you kind of view that in your mind, and any tips and advice that you can share.
Yeah, it's we could definitely spend hours on this particular topic and dive into all of the nuances, but I would say there's a few patterns that work really well in someone's favor. Generally, you want to create a situation where you're not the one reaching out, but it's people approaching you. So how do you create this effect of inward traction? And there's a few kind of levers to pull as an entrepreneur. It generally starts with the team. Like, how can you just build an awesome team? Is the team really well suited for a particular task? Is it well balanced? Do you only have, hardcore engineers on your team, or do you have a good balance of somebody who's really thinking about your community ecosystem plus really hardcore engineers? So there's certain things you can control about that. You can control the timing of a fundraise as well. So if for example, last year, summer, kind of August onwards, a lot of VC funds already deployed their funds and were raising their next fund. So if you're trying to fundraise during that time, then very, very difficult to get a lot of commitments very, very quickly. So that's one thing you can control. The other thing you can control is what type of fundraise is it? Is it a community-based fundraise, or do you go after traditional kind of VC investors? With VC investors, they will look at a number of factors. It's like team, go-to-market, how are you thinking about your ecosystem? What are your tokenomics? What's the kind of novel unlock of the narrative as well? And those are just kind of the table stakes. And then the key game becomes, how do I convince the very first investor that's high quality, that's a good fit with me, to give me that initial term sheet? So that's all that matters. Like, nothing else matters at that point. Because a lot of entrepreneurs, what they try to do first is like, I need to raise, 5 million at 50 million pre or something like that. It's like, who cares about the price? You're not optimizing for that. You're optimizing for finding the best partner to work with you. Because once you have that in place, then the momentum starts happening, and you want the momentum to work in your favor. So just like in community, you need mindshare, you need investor mindshare initially. And so those are some of the key ingredients to it. And then you can really dive into each one of the nuances, because there's also deal making. Like, how do you structure the deal correctly? How do you get something across the line? How do you prevent somebody from, just kind of being very passive? Because the general response is, hey, I see 100 deals and I'm going to say no to 99 of them. How are you the one that people feel like, oh, this is very exciting? And there's some strategies for that too. Like, if somebody launched that's similar to you on an exchange and did really well, then that's perfect timing to actually start a fundraise, because then there's momentum behind it and people can actually see like, okay, this is going to be a big outcome for me. I have certainty around it. So yeah, there's a lot of tactics and both strategy that can be used.
Yeah, I really appreciate those tips, Michael. I think like what happens is that as any of the day in the crypto space, there's like specific verticals, right? Every vertical has its like own like challenges, meta, and so on, right? So it's really like, to your point, how do you differentiate with the team first and foremost, and then how do you make sure that you're creating the right environment? Also understanding the environment, right? So that you are able to then tap into those opportunities if that does happen. And like to your point, like getting the lead is quite important. Otherwise, like you're just stating price for the sake of stating price, right? And all that kind of good stuff. But it's super awesome to have kind of share some of these advice and tips.
Yeah, one additional thing actually, I just want to mention around that too is the metas happen very quickly in kind of Web3, and so that meta has to feel genuine to the builder as well. Like if you just say like, oh, I'm just going to slap AI on this now because it's the general thing, investors can generally see through it, because they'll look at your team and like, oh, they can't execute on this. Like this is just another ChatGPT wrapper. Like why are they doing this? You don't want to be in a situation like that. So build something that's like genuine to you, and eventually the meta might turn in your favor as well. Just like virtuals, for example, they've been around for quite a while, but it wasn't until recently that agents became a hot topic. And so, yeah, don't be swayed just by the mood swings of the market.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think like even like recently with the poly market sort of like popularity and so on too, they've been building prediction markets on chain for a long time, right? And then it was really only with the recent elections that it became obvious almost that, hey, you should be looking at this particular product and so on. So sometimes it's one of those things where you kind of need to like just hunker down and just kind of go and be willing to sort of like seek that feedback from the community and so on, and then be in the right place at the right time when a meta comes back to you. Yeah. That's a really good tip. I think Michael, any like last thoughts for like, looking ahead for you guys as well in 2025? What should people be looking out for, on the 0G side or on your end too, in this year? It's going to be a big year, I'm sure, but I'm curious, how would you kind of like, share that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the last just weeks and months have been very intense because we're on our road to mainnet essentially. So working on getting our initial version of the mainnet out, and there's just so much more to build. I mean, we don't feel like we'll have a very strong consensus mechanism until even V2 of our mainnet, just because these engineering challenges are really hardcore engineering challenges. Like, how do you scale the execution layer in a very modular and like infinitely scalable fashion, for example? So very pumped about our technology. Eventually we'll have the full AI operating system built as well. So you can use all of compute, that includes fine tuning and training, agentic type of frameworks, and we'll support multiple on that. Our agent marketplace is going to be really exciting. So just a lot of really great initiatives for builders to be able to build whatever they want in this space with whatever tools in a very modular fashion for them. But yeah, definitely join in the movement to make AI public good, to build with the largest AI chain. We have more than 300 projects building with us. So love to see you on our layer one.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thanks for coming on the podcast as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Really enjoyed it.